Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rain Engineering Manufacturing Know-How podcast. Today, we're talking food safety and the Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically Section 204. I'm Don Rahrig, CEO of Rain Engineering, and today I'm talking with a group of industry experts about an upcoming FDA requirement that will change how companies track food products through their supply chains. These requirements, generally referred to as the FSMA Section 204, go into effect in January of 2026. And if you work with consumables, regardless of whether you're a small manufacturer or a global corp, this rule will affect you, and the time to prepare is now. So we'll dig into the details of what this means and what you can do about it. And this is the first of a series of podcasts we'll do on this topic. So go ahead and hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any of the future recordings. And now, if you're familiar with Section 204, you're probably got a lot of questions. If it's news to you, stay tuned. We'll bring you up to speed. We've got experts from both sides of the issue, including the FDA, here to explain what's going on. Joining me today is Christopher Waldrop. Christopher is a senior health scientist from Division of Public Health, Informatics and Analytics at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at FDA. He leads across-agency work groups to advance agency priorities on nutrition, food safety, and biotechnology issues. We also have Scott Butler. Scott is a manufacturing coach with the FSO Institute and the former VP of Research and Development at Del Monte. His leadership responsibilities include new product development and commercialization, supply chain optimization, quality and food safety, consumer affairs, regulatory and government affairs, among many others. We also have Joe Gerstl with us. Joe is director at GE Vernova's Prophecy Software and Services. He's partnered with hundreds of companies to improve their operations, solutions, and processes, spanning nearly every manufacturing industry, including food and beverage, aerospace, consumer packaged goods, and automotive. And I've known Joe for 15 years and really happy to have him here today. Dan Kubik is the vice president of sales at Rain Engineering. He has a dynamic background in both public and private sectors, primarily in manufacturing and operational technology. So I want to welcome my guests today. Thanks very much, everybody, for being here.
Yeah.
Let's just get started at the beginning. Joe, I think you wanted to kick this off for us.
Yeah, I'd love to. So really interesting topic. And Chris, I want to ask you a couple questions. There's a lot of FDA regulations already around FSMA and so forth. What's the kind of the history of just the FSMA Act in general, and what's the specific intent of this new FSMA 204 element that was added to the FSMA?
Yeah, so the Food Safety Modernization Act goes back. It was passed by Congress, signed into law in 2011, and it really followed on the heels of a whole host of high-profile foodborne illness outbreaks. So Congress decided to pass this law to give FDA new food safety authorities. And those authorities included things related to produce safety and preventive controls. It included intentional adulteration, import safety. And then the last provision that FDA has been implementing is this one on traceability, the Section 204, and what we call the food traceability rule. Focuses on identifying the points in the supply chain where it's most important to collect traceability information. And those are called critical tracking events. And then identifying what is that information that should be kept at each of those points. And those are called key data elements. And that standardizes traceability information across the supply chain so that when we're conducting outbreak investigations, we know what information that we're going to be asking for, and the industry knows what information that they can provide to us. And that's going to speed up our ability to conduct these traceback investigations when there's a foodborne illness outbreak.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I know that the FSMA itself covers basically anything you can put in your mouth and chew or swallow. But I think that this new FSMA 204 is a smaller subset of foods. Which foods are covered by this new regulation?
Yeah, so one of the requirements in the Food Safety Modernization Act, in addition to FDA developing this traceability system, was to identify the foods for which those additional record-keeping requirements were required. And so what we did is we put together a risk ranking model for food tracing, and we put in 20 years of data into the model. And that's data involving things like outbreaks and illnesses. It's a likelihood of contamination of a food. It's industry interventions, it's cost of illness. We crunched all that data, and then based on the data, we put together a list that we're calling the food traceability list. And the foods that are on that list are the ones that are covered by the rule. And so those are things like soft cheeses, shell eggs, nut butters. A lot of produce is on the list, like cucumbers and tomatoes, fresh peppers, sprout, fresh cut fruits and vegetables. There's also fin fish and seafood on the list, and deli salads. And so that list is available on our website. Anybody that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds a food on that list is then covered by the rule.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, that's some all subset. It's very interesting how you came upon that subset by analyzing the data and identifying the most susceptible foods. That makes a lot of sense. What are you thinking about adding more to this list, or is it kind of a fixed list, or what's the future hold for this Prisma 204?
Yeah. So in some cases, if a multi-ingredient food uses a food that's on the list as an ingredient in the same form that you see, then that multi-ingredient food is also covered. So it does expand out a little bit beyond what you see in the list. So for example, fresh tomatoes are on the list. And if you use a fresh tomato in a prepared sandwich, that prepared sandwich would then be covered by the rule because it contains that fresh tomato, and that fresh tomato is on the list. So it does expand out a little bit more to some of those multi-ingredient foods that use a listed food as an ingredient. But in terms of the list itself, we do intend to update that about every 5 years. We'll take that model, update it with all the newest and latest data and information, and then we will rerun that model so that we come up with a revised list. And then we'll go through a public process. So we'll post that revised list for the public. We'll take public comment on it. We will then consider those comments and then come up with a revised final version of that list. And then we'll publish that for the public to see as well. And so foods could come on or could come off the list depending on what the model and the data tells us. And so if a food comes on the list, that food would have 2 years before it to come into compliance. If the food comes off the list, that then is immediate. So if the food comes off the list, and then it no longer has to follow the regulations. So, again, that'll be done every 5 years or so based on what the data tells us. That will determine what the new list looks like.
Okay.
So, Chris, you said if a food is added to the list, you have 2 years to become compliant. When do manufacturers and packagers need to become compliant with FSMA 204?
Right. So the compliance date is January 20th, 2026. It is coming up. And that is the compliance date for all entities covered by the rule. Some previous rules have done staggered compliance dates. But for traceability, the way traceability works is if the whole supply chain is working together. So that's why all firms have to come in compliant at the same time. And that's for both domestic entities as well as any foreign firms that are producing food for U.S. consumption. So those foreign firms also are covered by the rule, also have to come into compliance at that same date.
Great. So you said all entities that have to become compliant. Does that include manufacturers that might make a product as like an intermediary or an ingredient to the final product that uses those same list of traceability ingredients?
Yeah, so it depends on what ingredient they're using, obviously, but if they are using an ingredient on the list, then they're covered by the rule, and so they have to come into compliance. So, a food, it goes through, we all know it goes through many steps sometimes before it gets to that grocery store. Some of those are just distribution steps. Some of those are transformation steps where the food is being changed or transformed in some way. And so any kind of using a listed food would also need to come in compliance as well.
Yeah, Chris, just to follow up one thing, you said this regulation applies to internationally sourced food products. Is there a process underway for the FDA to sort of notify other countries that this requirement is coming?
Yeah, it's a big world, right? So there's a lot of people that import food into the U.S. We are in a process of getting that information out. FDA has a number of foreign offices throughout the world, and we're working with those foreign offices to get that word out and talk to the industries and the regulatory authorities that are in those countries and those regions so that they know that this rule is coming and that they need to comply with it, providing the information that they need to be able to do that. So yeah, we are making that effort. Of course, would love to work with other folks to help get that word out as well, because there's a lot of companies out there that would be covered.
Yeah, it is a big world. So, Chris, following up on that question, I've heard some food production companies that produce products that come under the new FSMA 204 regulation are thinking that they will not need to change their process as much to comply with the new regulation because they already have the capability to trace one forward and one back. What additional requirements will these companies have in going into the future with 204 in addition to their one forward, one back trace capability?
Yeah, so this new rule builds on that one up, one back regulation, and it goes beyond it. I would recommend that companies really do look at the regulation, look at the rule, and identify what are the key data elements they're already keeping, and then see whether or not they have to keep other additional ones based on what the requirements are in the rule. Chances are that most companies are already maintaining a lot of the key data elements that are required simply in the course of doing business, right? They know the food that they're manufacturing. They know the quantity of the food they're shipping. They know when they shipped it and where they shipped it to, where they shipped it from. So a lot of those key data elements are ones that they're already keeping, and they're not going to have to kind of duplicate those. There are going to be some key data elements that are maybe new, like traceability lot code source. Happy to talk about that a little later, but there are some new ones that they may want to be sure that they're maintaining and figure out how they're going to be maintaining it. Another requirement that even though people have traceability systems in place now, a requirement under the rules is that they have to maintain a traceability plan. And so that's something new that everyone's going to have to do, and happy to answer questions or talk about that as well. But that's something that they need to look at and see what they need to do for that requirement.
Yeah. And could you articulate for us a little bit about what would be expected to be in that traceability plan?
Yeah, sure. So anybody that's covered by the rule has to maintain a traceability plan. And that traceability plan is really going to be used so that when we come to your firm or your facility and we start asking you to provide records for traceability, that traceability plan helps us understand your records and helps us understand how you maintain those records and what your traceability system looks like. So it's really designed to allow us to get in there, understand your system very quickly, and immediately start going through your records and understanding them. So that traceability plan has to keep things like information about how you maintain your records, how you identify foods on the list that you handle, how you assign lot codes, traceability lot codes, if you assign those. There has to be a point of contact in that plan because we need somebody that we need to be able to ask a question of. And so we need, who is that person? And so that information is there. And then for entities like farms or aquaculture farms, they have to also include a farm map so that we know where the foods that are on the list were grown on your farm. So it makes it easier for us to identify and narrow in our investigations. And then if you're making changes to your traceability system, changes to the foods you handle, that traceability plan has to be updated as well.
And the compliance date for that is also January
2026. Yeah.
Great.
So, Chris, this sounds a lot more intensive than the current one up, one back, that where a lot of manufacturers say, right, when you go in, you can ask for a specific lot and they just want to see where it went to or where did it come from. So it sounds like manufacturers definitely have to have more information available for you, for the FDA or whoever when they come in.
So maintaining records about what happens when you do those activities. Those are some of the critical tracking events I mentioned before. So yeah, it really does go beyond that one up, one back that folks have been familiar with.
So Joe, I have a question for you regarding technology, right? You're at the helm of the MES development at GE Vernova for the Prophecy Suite. What changes have you had to make to the product in order to help customers with this? Or tell me about how equipped you were already to deal with changes to regulatory like this.
Sure. So a lot of folks that are already running the GE Vernova Prophecy MES solution will have a lot of this information already as part of their traceability and genealogy. So if you are producing batches of, say, soft cheese, you're going to have the ability you should probably already have captured the milk that went into the cheese, any additives that were put into the cheese. And then if you use that cheese in another product, perhaps to make a different food group, then you should also have that ability to track that lot into the new product that you made. So it is one up and one back, but each one of those has a one up and one back. So you should have that traceability already. There are some new things related to the key data elements that we don't track natively in the NES, but we have a concept of properties or attributes that you can add to any batch that you're making in a consistent fashion, such that that batch now collects these additional pieces of information, whether they could come from the equipment directly, or they could come from somebody keying them in, or they come from another system. But these elements can be easily added on to the various batches that you're tracking. So we do take care of that too.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting just nuance of the rule. You mentioned making soft cheese and how there's milk and rennet and other ingredients that go into it. When you look at the list, the soft cheese is what's actually on the list. So we don't actually require traceability from FDA's standpoint for those ingredients, that milk and those rennet. It's really just that soft cheese. And as soon as you make the soft cheese, then for us, the traceability requirements kick in. So there are some nuances like that you have to kind of dig into a little bit. For business purposes, a lot of people keep those records for those ingredients. But for us, we're only looking at that soft cheese piece of it. So kind of interesting, some of those nuances that come up.
It is. I have a particular question, I guess, for the role you play, Chris, and the role maybe others play from a regulatory standpoint. How much help do you end up having to give manufacturers in just understanding the regulations and what those requirements are?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of outreach, a lot of education, a lot of webinars and podcasts like these. So these have been really, really great in helping us reach the industry in through venues that they're already using. So these types of things have been really helpful. We've also put up a ton of resources on our website. There's supply chain examples, different web pages, different tools that are available. So lots of stuff there that we can use. And we've been working with a lot of trade associations, a lot of other industry associations to be able to give them information so that they can work with their members and try to come in compliance with the rule.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And if there's any of those sites or anything you'd like published along with this podcast, just pass those along to us and we'll be sure to add those when we do our final edits. All right.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely send those.
So with regards to the regulation refers to traceability lot codes and the key data elements, critical tracking events. How are these requirements different from the lot codes that we have assigned to products in the past?
Yeah, so for the traceability lot code, it's very similar to what industry is already doing when it comes to traceability lot codes. We are kind of talking about it in the same way with the rule. And the way we describe it is traceability lot code is a descriptor that's often alphanumeric that's used to uniquely identify a traceability lot within your records. And so that's the way we define it. But again, it's very similar to how industry already uses lots and uses lot codes. For the purposes of the rule, though, you can only assign a traceability lot code when you do one of three things. And that is initially packing a food, when you first receive it on land for food from a fishing vessel, and when you transform a food. Those are the only times you can assign a lot code under the rule. Otherwise, if you're doing something like shipping the food or receiving it, you have to just pass along that traceability lot code. So you're not allowed to change it at that point. You just kind of pass it along to the next point. Because that way, we are often doing outbreak investigations by lot code if we can. And so that way we can follow that lot code through the supply chain and be able to find out where are those points where the food was handled and where it was potentially contaminated or something went wrong. So that lot code is really important to us. And the place where that lot code was assigned, that's the traceability lot code source. That piece of information is really important too, because that allows us to skip steps and get right to that point where that food was handled.
So go ahead, Joe.
I just had a question as long as you're talking about the traceability lot code. So customers already have some lot number on their products that they're making, of course. So really, they're going to create this additional number and put it on the label, for example. Is that how that would work? And how does that traceability lot code get from one supplier to the next supplier? Is that just from people, or is there another electronic system that gets sent through, or how does that?
Well, I have one follow-up to that, Chris, too, is not only how does it get from one place to another, but like, is that regulated or is that left up to the manufacturer? So a two-part question there.
Yeah, good question. So that traceability lot code, we don't specify how it gets defined. We wanted to provide flexibility to the industry because we know they developed lot codes in different ways and everybody kind of has their own way of doing it. So we didn't want to specify a specific way. So we left that up to the industry. They can define a traceability lot code any way they want. And so if they're already doing it, it can be that same code. It doesn't have to be a new one. It doesn't have to be one just for this rule. they can use that same code they're already using. And then they can transmit that code to the next point in the supply chain in the way that best works for their business and their supply chain. So it doesn't have to be on the label. It can, but it doesn't have to be. It can be like in a bill of lading. It can be on an ASN. It could be in just an email if they wanted to do it that way. We kind of left a lot of flexibility in that way so that industry can figure out what is the best way to transmit that information from one point to the next. We do have a web page that gives some examples of traceability lot codes, and we can share that link as well. But again, it doesn't have to be any one way. We left built in a lot of flexibility so the industry could do it in the way that works best for them.
I'm here running the technical things. So regarding specifics around the reference in the regulation to a requirement that an electronic sortable spreadsheet has to be produced and communicated to the FDA on demand. What is included in the spreadsheet? How long do we have to transmit the spreadsheet, that information back to FDA once you make that request? And then what are the differences in the information in the spreadsheet, and how is that different than the one forward, one back requirement?
Yes, thanks for bringing this up, because this is an important piece. In a regular day-to-day business, and even during an inspection that FDA might do, we're not requiring you to keep those records or send them to us in any way. You have to keep them, but you don't have to send them to us on a regular basis. But in the course of an outbreak investigation or a recall or other threat to public health, we may require those records be provided to us in an electronic sortable spreadsheet. The reason for this is that oftentimes we're given records in scanned PDFs, paper records, a whole bunch of data, and we have to sort through that and figure out how it all fits together. If the data can be provided to us in an electronic sortable spreadsheet, we can more quickly sort that data and analyze it. So that's the reason for the requirement for electronic sortable spreadsheet. And the way that's going to work is that we're going to ask for a certain set of records based on the outbreak investigation we're conducting. So it's going to be kind of a time frame or a set of products or maybe a certain lot codes. And then those are the records we would ask to be provided in electronic sortable spreadsheet. It's not all your records for all your foods for the past 2 years. It's just kind of based on that outbreak investigation. And then those are going to be the same records that you're maintaining already under the traceability rule. So you would provide us the records for whatever critical tracking events you're conducting, and it would be the key data elements that are required in the rule. So we have a template that's up on our website that folks can download, they can use. They don't have to, but they can use it if they want. And that has a different tab for every critical tracking event, lays out all the key data elements. So it should be pretty easy to fill in and then provide back to us.
Awesome.
Chris, we keep hearing you talk about critical tracking events and key data elements. Can you speak to any more about what those may be in detail?
Yeah, thanks. So critical tracking events are those points in the supply chain where it's most important to collect traceability information. And those are places where the food is harvested, where the food is cooled, where the food is initially packed for a raw agricultural commodity, where the food is initially received on land for food from a fishing vessel, where the food is transformed, where the food is shipped from, and where the food is received. And so those are the critical tracking events. And at each of those points, we're requiring certain information to be kept that helps us understand what happened to the food at that point. And those are the key data elements. And so key data elements are different depending on the critical tracking event that's being performed. But generally, some key data elements are the name of the food or the type of food, the quantity, the unit of measure, how much of that food was transformed or how much that food was shipped, where it was shipped to, where it was shipped from, that traceability lot code I mentioned, that's a key data element. So it depends on the critical tracking event, but in general, there are key data elements that are about that food and what happened to that food at that point.
So when manufacturers store this data, when they already have to keep it for a certain amount of time, do they have to keep this data longer? Is there some time frame for any? Is this just new data that they only need for, say, 2 years or whatever it might be?
Yeah, so the time frame for keeping that data is 2 years. It can be on paper, electronic. It can be in any kind of format they want, but it just has to be, you have to maintain it for 2 years. And then again, if we're asking for records during an outbreak, they'd have to kind of take those records and put them into electronic sortable spreadsheet to provide to us.
Okay, so the only thing that they would have to provide, regardless of how they store it, they have to provide you with the spreadsheet. So when you call and the template of the spreadsheet, they have to fill all of that in based on each ingredient then.
Okay. Yeah. And based on kind of what we're asking for, what's the food of interest or what's the critical tracking event they're performing. Now, for something like inspections, we're not going to request that electronic sortable spreadsheet during an inspection, a routine inspection. In that case, we would just ask to see the records and you'd provide them in the way that you maintain them. But in that outbreak situation, that's where the electronic sortable spreadsheet comes in.
Because during an inspection, you're not really transforming any. So it's really when you transform the product from one
or even when you're shipping it, right? We may ask to see those shipping records so we know what you shipped out and when you shipped it out. And so it really is kind of depending on what is that activity you're doing. For example, when we're starting an outbreak investigation, oftentimes we start at retail. And so we're going to ask to see a grocery store's receiving records for a particular food that is part of that maybe outbreak investigation. So they're going to have to show us those receiving records that they maintain because that's what they had to maintain as part of the role.
Got it.
I have lots of great, smart people on my team, but it's relatively, I don't get very deep into the topic. I'm curious about, with regards to an event, whatever the event is, once you know there's a problem and you start an investigation, is there a most effective critical time period for the investigation? In other words, how quickly can you get your hands around the scope and magnitude of a problem? And how much will 204 help shorten that window, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question because outbreak investigations take many different forms, right? Everyone is different based on the situation. But there's a lot of steps before we find out that something's happening. So somebody, the food has to become contaminated. Somebody has to eat the food and get sick. Then they have to go to their doctor. Then the doctor has to see that they're sick enough to be able to request them to take a stool sample. They have to take a stool sample. They have to then have that analyzed by the lab. That information gets uploaded into a central database. And then if enough people are getting sick and enough of those samples are getting uploaded in the database, then the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, starts seeing a pattern. And so they start recognizing, oh, maybe this is a problem. They start investigating, usually in conjunction with state and local health inspectors or health regulators, as well as sometimes the FDA or in some cases USDA, to look at, okay, maybe what is, what's making people sick? What's the food? And then only then do they we start figuring out, okay, now where did that food go from? So there's this long process before we even kind of jump into action and try to trace that food through the supply chain. 204 is intended to once we know what the food is or have an idea of maybe what the food is, and then we start doing those traceback investigations. Section 204 and the food traceability rule is intended to speed that process up so that we can more quickly and efficiently work our way through the supply chain, figure out where that food came from, where it went, where it got contaminated, and get that food off the market as fast as possible. But there is this longer process before we even know there's an outbreak and start investigating it.
Yeah, no question about that. It's a complicated issue for sure. Chris, Scott, Joe, thanks so much for sharing your insights today, your expertise on the FSMA 204. It's a big topic and there's a lot more to learn. I think we learned a lot today and the listener will learn too. So remember, everyone, this is the first in a series of Manufacturing Know-How podcasts covering Section 204. Up next, we'll talk about how to cover some of these important capabilities using MES technology. So go ahead and hit that follow button so you don't miss it. And thanks again to our guests. I'm Don Rahrig from Rain Engineering. Thanks for listening.